Alright, so now in this video we're going to take a look at how to light our scene with using Vray Next. Now in the previous scenes we've seen a couple of different ways to light up our scenes, and this is one of the scenes that we used to showcase our global illumination. As you can see, we have a pretty simple room, three windows on the side, Vray sun coming from the side. We have a Vray sky in the environment map, and we have three different Vray lights set up to work as Skylight Portals. So now, if we open up the render, this is basically how our scene looks like at the moment. So now, this was done with using the Vray 2.4 version. Now we're going to see how we can use this to expedite things by using Vray Next. The first thing that we're going to do is I'm going to close this, and I'm going to open up the settings by pressing F10. And in here, I'm going to make sure that primarily Vray Next is chosen. So at the moment of the recording, this is the latest version, so it's update 3.1. And what I want to do is I want to set up my IPR so we can see the changes happening right away. Now, I'm going to go over to the image sampler, change it from bucket to progressive, put down the rendering time to 0 so we have no time limit. I'm going to check the GI, put it on a primary engine as brute force, and light cache. We can leave it light cache. All right, so having done this, I'm going to start the IPR, and then we can start from there. All right, so I'm going to click on the start IPR, and this will give me a preview of the scene so I can work a bit faster. Now, the thing here is that this is still being calculated in the old way of working. So at the moment, the entire light coming into this scene is being calculated or it's being driven by these portals here. They're telling the light how to enter this room. Now, this will make it so it's a slower render. For example, if I stop the IPR for a moment and I make a full render, so I'm going to hit render, and I'll be right back. There we go. The entire scene renders, it's clean and everything, but we can see that since we haven't really spent any time trying to tweak through the settings, we can see that it's kind of overburned a bit. Now, the problem here also is that when you have overexposed scenes, the rendering time can be quite high. For example, just for this scene, it took around 23 minutes to finish the entire scene. Now, how do we get around this? Well, we can use another approach, which is going to be the approach that Vray Next introduced. This new approach is basically a rework of the Vray Dome light, and that is simply by just going inside this room or in this scene, we're going to put in a Vray Dome light, drop it in here, and in the options here in the dome light, I want to make sure that this adaptive dome is selected. Now, if this option is selected, it basically makes it so that everything that's being shone or everything or all the information that's coming from this light is going to be calculated correctly, and there will be no need for any or of adding of any of these sky portals. The light will be calculated correctly. So to see how this thing looks, I'm actually going to select both the sun and those sky portals and turn them off. So now the only thing that I have in this scene is just this Vray dome. I'm going to open up my environment tab, and from here I'm going to take the Vray sky and put it into the map for our dome light as an instance, and I'm going to turn off the background. So we're not going to use any of the environment information. So now at this moment, the only information or the only lighting information that I have is coming from that dome light. So now let's open up the VFB and hit a render and see how my scene is going to look. So here we are back with the render finished, and we can see that we have quite a pleasant look for the entire scene. And even though it doesn't have any help with or from the Vray portals, the light is coming pretty natural in this entire scene. But now, the problem here is still the rendering time. For example, this scene with just that light took 11.19 minutes to render. So what is the problem that we are still having for these higher than average render times? Well, another thing that can ramp up your rendering time is if your image is a bit overexposed. So what this means is, from what we saw in the previous videos of the Vray Lighting Course, is that you can change the way your scene is lit by changing the parameters of the light or change the parameters of the camera. So for example, if we select the camera on the side here, we can change how much light comes into the scene or how much light comes into the camera by changing the film speed ISO or the shutter speed. Now, every time we change the lighting scenario, we would have to compensate and change the ISO to basically match that scenario. So if we lower the sun, we're going to get a different look. So we would have to do the compensation in the ISO. Now, doing this manually can be a tedious job and take a lot of hard work, or not hard, but time-consuming work. Now, with Vray Next, we have a way to circumvent this issue. Namely, when you go over in Vray, scroll down to camera, you have these two options, auto exposure and auto white balance. Now, in order to see how this works, let's start the IPR and see it right away. I'm going to hit the start IPR right here. And I'm going to make this thing a bit smaller so we have a smaller window for a quicker preview. Alright, as soon as the light cache is built, we can see how our scene looks like. But now, another good thing that you can do while you're in the phase of setting up your lighting, and you want to see how your entire scene is going to look a bit faster, is I can stop this, go over to render elements, and in here add a Vray Denoiser and click OK. Now for the Denoiser, I'm just going to scroll down and change the denoising engine from the default Vray Denoiser down to NVIDIA AI Denoiser. The main difference between these two is that the NVIDIA AI Denoiser is a bit faster, especially for preview, and it does leave a bit more splotches. But since we just want to make sure that our scene is lit properly, we want to get faster feedback, so I'm going to leave it down to the Vray AI Denoiser. Now, go back over here and restart the IPR. There we go. So now, as soon as the light cache is built, the denoiser is going to start feeding up with information. It should give us a clear picture of the entire scene, which should be any second now. Now, take into account that at the moment we still haven't turned on the auto exposure or the white balance. So basically, this is how our scene looks like. There we go. The AI denoiser just kicked in, so we can see generally how this scene looks like. So now, by clicking the auto exposure, you're going to see right away that the scene is going to change. Click. There we go. The auto exposure has been applied. I can also click on the auto white balance, and this will make all the calculations for the entire scene and the amount of light entering it, and it will do the needed changes in order for us to get a more normal or more lifelike looking scene. There we go. Right away we can see that the actual lighting of the scene has changed. So now, just so we can see it better, I'm actually going to stop the IPR and I'm going to do a full render of this scene. As soon as the render is finished, I can see that my scene now looks a lot different from what we had previously. So if I compare it with the previous version and this one, we can see that now we have a much more bluish scene. Now this is mainly because the white balance has been changed in the camera settings. But if we go over here in our scene, we're going to see that neither the white balance or the film speed or the ISO has been changed. So what gives? How do we do that? If we want to take all of these settings that the auto exposure and the auto white balance take into calculation, we need to press this button where it says transfer to cameras. By pressing this, you can see right away that here this went from 100 down to 91, and the custom color for the white balance also changed. So now everything that the auto exposure and the auto balance did has been transferred to our scene. So if we turn off the auto white balance and the auto exposure now and restart the IPR, it will not make any changes because we have those settings set to our scene. And the main difference between these two versions is that this one, or the one without the actual auto exposure auto balance, the rendering time for doing it was 11.5 minutes, while this one, or the new one which has the automatic exposure and white balance, took only 6.5 minutes. So this version is basically done in 50% of the time, so twice as fast. Now, we also said that this is done without having to use any of these Skylight Portals. So what happens if you, for example, have Skylight Portals in your scene? Well, let's turn them back on and do another render with this same dome light. As soon as this thing is finished, now I can compare it with the scene, how it looks without having the Skylight Portals turned on. So on the left side here, we have with the Skylight Portals on, the right side without the Skylight Portals on. So as you can see, when I'm going left and right, there is literally no difference whatsoever on both of these scenes. The only difference is that if you're going to be using Skylight Portals with conjunction with that new type of lighting with the V-Ray dome, your rendering times are again going to go up. So this second version, so with the dome light and the different Skylight Portals, took 14 minutes compared with the 6 minutes on without the Skylight Portals. So we're going to turn it off. So we're going to turn off the Skylight Portals, and by just doing one simple thing, by adding in the new V-Ray dome light with the adaptive option on, we get the same result, but we are doing it twice as fast. Now, if we know that using that new dome light is so fast, how can we use it to our advantage to get better feedback on how our scene looks like? Well, we can test it out and see how it works with a HDRI light. To do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up hdrihaven.com, and from here I'm going to choose any of these HDRIs that we have in here. They're totally free, so click on whichever one you would like to test out. I've actually went ahead and downloaded a few, so let's test them out and see how this thing is going to look like. Now, first off, we're going to select our light and turn this thing off. Open up the material editor, open up the light, and remove this from here, so clear it off, and in here add a V-Ray HDRI in the slot. There we go, and just choose one of these. So for example, I've downloaded 4, so we're going to see how all of those look. I'm going to start with the first one, so click open, and that's it. I'm not going to change anything else. I'm just going to pull it into my material editor so I can see how it looks. All right, that's good. Now, let's hit a render and see how, or let's just start up the IPR. Click, and I'm going to downsize this thing a bit. There we go. Also, you can see we have the auto exposure and the auto white balance on. And here we go. Right away, I can see that my scene looks pretty decent just for straight out of the box lighting coming from an HDRI. So we haven't spent any time adding in any sorts of Vray lighting portals. We just changed the HDRI and this is what we get. Now the blurriness is due to the fact that we're using a denoiser for now, but as more time passes by we're going to get more information and this thing is going to clear up. If you don't like the look of the denoiser, you can always turn it off, but since we have it, now we can just work around with the horizontal rotation for the HDRI and get a totally different vibe for the entire scene. And since we are using the IPR, we can see how this thing looks right away. Now, also, another thing worth mentioning is that as you are changing the lighting scenario, the auto exposure keeps working all the time. So if you are actually doing an animation, you will not have to manually animate the exposure depending on where your camera is. So this is another very, very good thing that's going to help you expedite your projects. So this is how our scene looks like at the moment. So from what we saw so far, the auto exposure and the auto white balance are very, very helpful in our scene, but they do have some drawbacks. Namely, let's say you have some sort of a material in your scene that has an emissive to it, or an emissive look to it. What I've done here is I'm just going to unhide all. I've placed this teapot in the scene here. Now for it, I'm just going to change the material for the teapot to be emissive. Now notice what is going to happen in the entire scene as soon as this thing starts illuminating. I'm going to put it like this, and let's increase the multiplier to something like maybe 10. There we go. Now I haven't clicked on compensate camera exposure, but if I do it, it's even more pronounced. Now what is happening? We have the HDRI lighting the entire scene, but since this thing is emitting so much light, the camera sensor is being overflown with light, so it needs to do the automatic reduction, so less light is being driven inside the camera. Hence, the entire scene now is getting to be darker. So how do we deal with this if we have any sort of an emissive material in our scene? Well, for now, I'm just going to hide this thing. And right away, we have the original lighting for our scene. So what I need to do now is, if I have any sort of an emissive material, what I would do is I would stop my IPR and then transfer it to camera, all the settings. So let's just select our camera so we can see the changes. There we go. Just go over here, camera, rectangular, camera. Or we can just go like this. Select camera. Hit the transfer to camera, and this should change all the settings. There we go. So film ISO has been changed. All right, awesome. Now we're going to turn off both of these and turn on the IPR. We shouldn't see any changes now because all the settings that were coming from here have actually been transferred to our scene. Now if I go ahead and unhide, we can see that now we have that emissive teapot in the scene, and the rest of the scene is still receiving the proper illumination coming from the HDRI image. And we can change around the entire lighting scenario pretty quickly by just swapping out the HDRI or rotating it with whatever that we like. So by doing all of these things that we already mentioned in this entire lesson, you can expedite how fast you are lighting up your scene. You can iterate a lot faster by using the Denoiser to help you preview your scene. And if you're using the auto exposure, the auto white balance, you can get some pretty decent and fast results and natural lighting in your scenes pretty easy. And one last thing that I would like to add before we actually finish is that when you're going to be doing your final renders, if you're going to be using the Denoiser, I would go back to the render elements from Vray Denoiser. I will choose to render with the default Vray Denoiser because this will give you a much cleaner result in the end, and it should expedite your scene and make sure that there is literally no noise left in your scene. And with that, we're finished with this lesson.